for inviting me, but I confounded the time, you know, and I had a lecture until now, so I need wait a second. Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor, we can hear you. Good evening.
Okay, very good. Thanks so much. Sorry. I knew it was very tight when I told you, you know, I know I could not start until Q2. I know myself. I know, you know, because people ask questions and, you know, it was really very tight. And I confounded UK times and Paris times. And that's why it was a bit tight. But we'll manage. We'll manage. Okay. And that will be fine. Okay, very good. So, okay, so let's try to see what we can do. Okay. Yes.
Professor, can we just address a few technical issues first?
Yes.
I just wanted
to make me to share screen.
Yeah, I just wanted to check if you can do that.
Does that work?
Yeah, we can see your screen. That's great. So I'll just go ahead with a small introduction, and then if you're ready, we can start.
Excellent, excellent. Okay,
great.
Make sure. Okay, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so we can please do. And so I stop screen sharing or like this. Okay.
That's
Thank you.
Yeah.
My apologies. I'm being a bit under stress.
That's absolutely fine. Good evening, everyone. The Ashoka Economic Society welcomes you to the second webinar in this series of talks on the vision for a post-pandemic economy. The topic for this webinar is Rethinking Capitalism Post-COVID, the Power of Creative Destruction. We are here today with one of the finest thinkers in the field of economics today, Professor Philippe Aghion. Professor Aghion is currently teaching at College de France and London School of Economics. He has authored several books and served as the president of the European and French Economic Associations. Today, he will be shedding light on the power of creative destruction. This topic has become increasingly relevant to us today as we move on from the COVID-19 pandemic. Creative destruction tries to address the following contradiction. On the one hand, innovation rents are needed to motivate innovation activity. On the other hand, yesterday's innovators are tempted to use their rents to prevent subsequent innovation. Before we start, just a few ground rules for the audience. Please write any questions that you may have during the session in the Q&A box, and we'll recognize you at the end. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Aghion. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for inviting me. And my apologies for being late. I was teaching a class at the LSE. And now I'm fine. So it's we can start. Voilà. Thanks. And so it's a big honor to be with you today. And now we can start. So I will talk about my latest book, The Power of Creative Destruction. I also entitled this speech, The Rethinking Capitalism, The Power of Creative Destruction. So it's a joint book, which is published by Harvard University Press. And it's joined with Céline Antonin, who is a researcher at Sciences Po and Collège de France with me, and Simon Bunel, who is at Banque de France and Collège de France with me. That's Schumpeter, young, I think, young age Schumpeter. So creative destruction is this process whereby it's a term coined by Schumpeter himself to refer to the fact that new innovations displace old technologies. They make old technologies become obsolete. So creative destruction is this process whereby new innovations displace old technologies. For example, in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, or in other writings, Schumpeter, uses this term, coins this term, creative destruction. And but the problem is that when I studied economics, there were no such thing as a Schumpeterian growth model, a model of growth through creative destruction. It didn't exist. You had the neoclassical growth model, Ramsey, Solow, or the other models, but you didn't have models where innovations were central, and you didn't have models where creative destruction was a central part of the story. So that's what we did with Peter Howitt in 1987. We built a model. It's in Econometrica. It came out in Econometrica 1992, called a model of growth through creative destruction. And in this growth paradigm, long run, it has three main tenets. The first tenet is that long run growth is driven by cumulative innovations, where current innovations build upon previous innovations. Okay. The second main idea is that innovations result from entrepreneurial activities that are motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. Essentially, when you innovate, you get a local monopoly or local monopoly rent for a while until you are being imitated or made yourself obsolete by subsequent innovation. And the third one is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technologies. So we built a model that embodied those three elements. Okay. And what's very interesting is that, at the heart of the growth process described by this model, you have a contradiction. On the one hand, innovators are motivated by the prospect of monopoly rents, but on the other hand, those rents can be used ex post to prevent subsequent innovation and block new entry, because yesterday's innovators, they don't want themselves to be victims of innovation by subsequent innovators. So you see, the regulating capitalism is all about managing this contradiction, because on the one hand, you need to give rents to innovators, but on the other hand, you want to make sure they won't use these rents to prevent subsequent innovations. And in fact, through the whole book, whether you talk about, the industrial takeoff, whether you talk about, the middle income trap or secular stagnation or inequality, or you always come across this contradiction. It runs through the whole book. Schumpeter himself was deeply pessimistic about the future of capitalism. He thought that the first innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would successfully prevent subsequent innovations. And but we are in this book much more optimistic than Schumpeter, because we think that there are forces that can avert the pessimistic prediction that the first innovators would prevent any subsequent innovation. And the book is about how to mobilize these forces. So instead of being pessimistic, we are Gramsci optimists. We are the optimism of the will. It's not an optimism of it will happen anyway, but it's optimism that there are forces that can be mobilized to avert the pessimistic prediction of Schumpeter. So what the book does is to use the lens of creative destruction to do three main things. First, to revisit some main enigma in economic history. Second is to question some common wisdoms. And three, to rethink the future of capitalism. So let me talk about the enigma. First enigma is the industrial takeoff. The work of Madison shows that, in fact, essentially growth took off only recently in 1920 in Europe. There were some episodes of growth here and there before, but they were never long-lasting. And the true takeoff of growth goes back to only 200 years, which is nothing. And compared to, Sapiens is 10,000 years, Neanderthal much more. So, and only 200 years growth. Why so recent? Why in Europe? And we look at that in chapter 2 of the book. And that's very much Joël Mokyr. And Joël Mokyr gives elements that speak to the three aspects of the Schumpeterian growth model that I underline. The first one is a cumulative process of innovation. Well, Mokyr will tell you that in Europe, you had institutions that would make it possible to have cumulative innovation. In particular, universities, where you access knowledge freely, but also the Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica, or the French Encyclopedia. Those were things that would codify knowledge, make it much easier for prospective future innovators to build upon previous innovations, because they could more easily access the knowledge. The second thing is that there were in France, in England first, but then subsequently in France, there were revolutions. In England, you had the Glorious Revolution, and in France, you had the French Revolution. And they led to the emergence of institutions that would protect property rights, and in particular, property rights on innovations. And so before, the aristocracy would, at will, expropriate potential innovators, okay? So that's also very important to understand why that was in Europe more than elsewhere. Another thing that existed in Europe was the fact that you have competition between European countries. That made it possible to sustain creative destruction. If you had in China, in particular, for example, whenever you had a successful inventor, not only the incumbent firms would prevent that inventor, but also the emperor would be afraid that that inventor would become too powerful, and they would somehow silence the inventor. They would, they would put barriers to her continuing her research and innovation activities. In Europe, if you were bothering an inventor, if you hassle an inventor, then the inventor could move to a neighboring country and pursue her research or his research in a neighboring country. So you had France, but you had England, you had Prussia, Switzerland, and all these countries competed. And so France, I would not like to make life impossible to a researcher that would then migrate to a neighboring country and pursue the innovation in the neighboring country that competes with me. So that's interesting, because you see that shows that, the best explanation for the takeoff very much maps into the Schumpeterian paradigm. Another enigma is secular stagnation. It very interestingly, if you look at the average annual TFP growth in the US, it increased a lot between 1995 2005 and then declined a lot since 2005, in spite of having the IT and AI revolutions, the information technology and artificial intelligence revolutions. So how comes? So in chapter 6 of the book, we look at various explanations for the slowdown, and the most convincing is that the IT revolution made it possible to have superstar firms emerge that took advantage of this revolution. Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart, Facebook later on took advantage of the IT and became firms that became very so first, when those firms grew, that boosted growth in the US. But then what happened is that those firms, through mergers and acquisitions, they became prominent in most sectors of the economy, and they discouraged innovation in the other sectors. So you can see, by the way, it's very much linked to IT. The growth goes up and down in IT producing sectors, that's the black line, and in IT using sectors, which is the gray line. And what's very interesting is that the entry of new firms in the US declined since the 2000s, very much discouraged by these superstar firms. So you see, the problem there is that competition policy in the US did not adapt to the digital era. And we discussed that in chapter 6. They could do merger and acquisition, these superstar firms, without any limit, because nobody bothered that, that merger and acquisition by those firms could discourage subsequent innovation and entry. And that's what happened, in fact. In fact, you need to adapt competition policy to make sure that those superstar firms will no longer inhibit innovation by new potential entrants. Okay, so that's the chapter 6 of the book. But it's very much about entry and incumbents. But there again, you see the difference. Schumpeter would tell you nothing you can do about the superstar firms. Would Robert Gordon as well be pessimistic? Whereas we say, no, you can change competition policy in the US and somehow counteract this secular stagnation phenomenon. And that's where we are Gramscian optimists, you see. 1 second, let me get some glass of water. A third one is middle income trap. The middle income trap is the fact that you had some countries that start growing fast, like Argentina, for example, and then up to the 1930s, and then stop growing. But for example, Korea grew very fast between 1945 and the late 80s, and then stopped growing. Japan, which is not a middle income, it's an advanced country, also grew very fast between 1945 and the late 80s, and then stopped growing. And the phenomenon that we described that in chapter 7 of the book, we say, in fact, what happens is that there are several ways of growing. You can imitate more advanced technologies in developed countries, so that's catching up. That's the catching up growth. Or you can innovate at the frontier. I mean, you innovate upon yourself. You don't necessarily imitate others. You innovate yourself upon yourself. And the institutions that are good for catching up are not necessarily the same institutions that are good for frontier innovation. In particular, in chapter 4 of the book, we explain that competition is very important for innovation at the frontier, because at the frontier, I innovate to do better than my rival, okay? When you are in the business of catching up, competition is not so important. So we explained already in chapter 4 of the book that the more advanced the country is, the more competition policy enhances innovation and growth in that country. So what happened in Korea is that during the catching up phase between 1945 and the late 80s, not only you had the emergence of conglomerates, they call them chaebols in Korea. These conglomerates, not only they inhibit new entry by new potential entrants, but they also put pressure on government to not move into policies that would be good for frontier innovation. In particular, not move in favor of more competitive policy. They somehow, these big conglomerates prevented the necessary move towards more competitive institutions in order to foster frontier innovation. So that's why Korea was good at catching up, but not so good at frontier innovation. And very interestingly, we explained that in chapter 7 of the book on middle income trap, that when you had the financial crisis in Korea in the late 90s, it weakened the power of the conglomerates, that boosted entry, but it also made it possible for the government to move into more competitive policies, and which helped growth resume in Korea, actually. So that's what we do in chapter 7 with the middle income trap. But you see, again, it's very much the Schumpeterian framework, the incumbent and the entrant. And the incumbent not only prevents entry of new innovators, but also puts pressure on governments to not implement policies that would favor entry and competition. The last one is dynamic, a source of dynamic of inequality. There's been important work by Piketty, Saez, Atkinson, showing a fast rise in the share of income of the top 1% income earners in developed economies, and a rise in the share of income of the 0.1% income earners. That's a fact. The question is why? And what we explained that there are several sources of top income inequality. One of them is innovation, because when you innovate, you get rents from your innovation. I mentioned that before. That's what I call the Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs become rich because he innovates, he creates Apple. Mr. Bill Gates becomes rich because he creates Microsoft. Mr. Skype becomes rich because he creates Skype, okay? But there is another way to get top income. It's through entry barriers and lobbying. Mr. Carlos Slim in Mexico becomes rich because he's at the head of an unregulated telecom monopoly with the connivance, with collusion, in collusion with the political power. And he plays on that to become much richer. So you see, you have these two ways of becoming rich. One is the good way, which is innovation. One is the bad way, which is lobbying and entry barriers. And we want to contrast them. What's very interesting is that innovation, you can see here, that's chapter 5 of the book. And we show that wherever there is more innovation intensity, you have a higher share of income of the top 1%. That's the continuous curve. But and that's because when you innovate, you get rents from innovation. So that's not so surprising. But what you can see as well is that if you look at the effect of innovation intensity on the Gini, which is a more global measure of inequality, then you see no effect. And the reason is that innovation, which already increases growth, it's a good source because already innovation is good for growth. But innovation has the fact that it's true that on the one hand, innovation increases top income inequality. But on the other hand, innovation increases social mobility. And that you can see here. You know, more on average, if I had to fit a straight line, it's clearly an upward sloping line. Wherever there is more innovation intensity, especially on the highest levels of innovation intensity, you have more social mobility. And why? Because of creative destruction. One reason is that it's particularly innovation by entrants replace incumbents. That induces social mobility. So particularly innovation by entrants induces social mobility. But there is another reason, is that innovative firms, they provide better career prospects, including to unskilled workers. So here we look at the wage dynamics of unskilled workers. In innovating firms, it's the continuous curve, and non-innovating firms is the dotted curve. And you see that innovating firms pay better their unskilled workers, but also the wage goes up by more. They have better wage prospects, better prospects of wage progression in a worker in an innovating firm than in a non-innovating. And the reason is that it's much more important in an innovating firm to be efficient, to be reliable, to coordinate with other workers and other assets in the firm than in non-innovating firms. So you see innovation, it's true, it creates top income inequality, but you see it's a good source because it creates growth, it creates social mobility, and as a result, it does not increase global inequality. You see the dotted line is not there. Whereas if I put lobbying instead, lobbying reduces growth because lobbying prevents entry. So that's bad for growth. Lobbying increases top income inequality, but it also reduces social mobility. So if I had lobbying, it would be decreasing here because more lobbying means less entrant innovation and not therefore less social mobility. And because it increases both top income inequality and reduces social mobility, lobbying would increase the Gini. So if instead of innovation intensity here on the horizontal axis, I had the lobbying intensity, I would have a dotted curve that would also be sharply increasing. So you see, that's why it's very important to know that you have the good source of inequality and the bad source, and you should distinguish between innovation and lobbying as sources of top income inequality and not deal with them the same way. And that's my difference with Piketty. In the world of Piketty, you only have lobbying and hairs. You never have innovation in his world, okay? Yeah, this being said, even Steve Jobs, I have to make sure that he will not use his wealth to prevent subsequent innovation. So I need taxation policy there and competition policy. So it's true you should not treat innovators and lobbyists the same way, but still all income, all wealth accumulated through all ranks, you should make sure they won't be used to prevent subsequent innovation. And there you achieve through tax policy, but also through competition policy. So that concludes the first part. Now I do the second thing that we do in the book is to question common wisdom. So give me 1 minute to breathe. Okay. So now you are, in the book, we use the Schumpeterian framework to question common wisdom. The first wisdom is that you should tax robots to protect employment. We show in the chapter 3 of the book, based on work with my co-author in the book plus Xavier Jaravel, that firms that automate in France, they create employment. And they create employment because they become more productive. Okay? Because their export price goes down in particular. So because their export price goes down, sales go up. And because sales go up, they need more, they employ more because they have bigger demand for their products. So they become more productive, they increase market share worldwide, therefore they increase their demand for their product, therefore they need to hire more. So if you tax robots, it would be counterproductive because it would discourage those firms from hiring more. Because it would discourage some firms from doing something that makes them more productive and increases, therefore, their market share worldwide. Okay? Second idea, protectionism is the way to regain control of value chains. No, we explained that in chapter 13. In chapter 13, we explained that, the problem with protectionism is that if you have a protectionist policy, the destination country will close export markets to you. And if they close export markets to you, it reduces your innovation incentives. But therefore, it will reduce your ability to regain control of value chains. And in fact, as it turns out, innovation is key to regain control of value chains. Here you see, we show Germany and France in COVID products. The COVID products we look at, it was prior to the vaccines. It was respirator, mask, and tests. The black curves are Germany. The gray curves are France. The triangle are exports, the circles are imports. You see, Germany was a little bit better than France in 2002, but now Germany is much better. They export more, but they also import more. They didn't achieve that through tariffs and trade war, through protectionism. No, they invested and innovated. And that's how they have now a 20 billion surplus in these products, whereas France has zero surplus essentially on these products. Okay? So that's what they do. And France didn't do well because France, in fact, when it comes to innovation, it deteriorated. The dotted line is the frontier in terms of triadic patents in medical technologies and pharmaceutical products. So triadic is patents that are registered in the US Patent Office, the US Patent Office, the Japanese Patent Office, and the European Patent Office. You see, France was very close to the frontier in 1995. And you see now France has moved away from the frontier. The frontier is a dotted line here. And we moved away from it. And that's why we deteriorated. So innovation, you see, so the problem with protectionism is that protectionism, in fact, ends up reducing your innovation incentives, but your innovation is what makes you competitive worldwide, you see, that's the thing. And a third common wisdom, negative growth is the way to stop climate change. It's true, historically, temperature went up, that's the IPP, IPCC report. If you look at temperature worldwide, it started taking off exactly when growth took off in the early 19th century. And it's absolutely due to growth. So it's true, historically, growth is responsible for the temperature going up. And that's what happened in reality, and that's the counterfactual here. So you could say, and you could also look at China and India. India and China, CO2 emissions take off when growth takes off. So historically, it's true, growth is responsible. But you see, you could be very naive and said, well, look, then you should say, well, but then what you should do is to go back to pre-19th century. But that would be crazy because we got so much from growth. Our standards of living improved a lot, our health improved a lot, life expectancy, quality of life, everything. We got so much from it. I mean, who would want to go back to prior to the Industrial Revolution? Also, we had a natural experiment. It was the first lockdown. In France, we had a lockdown between March and May 2020. And GDP went down by 35%. CO2 emissions went down by 8%. So if we were to rely only on negative growth, it means we should remain permanently under the first lockdown. I don't know in India, but in France, we had to do it at the time. There was no vaccines. But the first lockdown had dramatic effects on psychology, particularly for the young generations. They suffered a lot from the first lockdown. You would not want to be permanently there. So the alternative is green innovation. Innovation to look for new sources of energy or to save on energy and to save particularly on CO2 energy. You see what I mean? And that's what you do. So the problem is, and that we describe that in chapter 9 of the book, the problem is that firms that innovated in dirty technologies in the past tend to innovate in the future in dirty technologies. We call that path dependence in the direction of innovation. Now, that implies that creative destruction should help us because new firms don't have that problem of path dependence. They didn't exist yesterday. The second thing is that the state can redirect technical change of firms through carbon tax, through subsidies to green innovation, and through industrial policy. But consumers can also play a role by the name and shame. If they know which products generate more CO2 or less CO2, consumers can put pressure on firms to reduce CO2 emissions. All the more when you have more competition among firms, because if there is only one monopoly, well, you have to purchase from that monopoly. But if you have several firms, then the firms will compete and they will innovate green to escape competition with a rival. So the combination between information of consumers or willingness of consumers to go green and competition on the product market, that is a very powerful tool to induce greener innovation. So it's very interesting because you see that green innovation will be what gets us out of this. And there are several tools: carbon price, carbon tax, industrial policy, and subsidy to green innovation, and this combination between consumers' action and competition policy. So that's, and the triangle between firms, state, and civil society, particularly consumers, this triangle plays a very big role in making our economies cleaner, in pushing firms to innovate cleaner. So that we make a big deal of that in chapter 9 and also again in chapter 15. So now let me take 1 minute because I arrived to the last part of the book. So now I would like in fact, the COVID, I want to rethink capitalism. The COVID crisis has been a revelator. It has revealed a broken social model in the US. But in Europe, it has shown the weaknesses of its innovation system. So let me go into those in turn. So we talk about that chapter 15 and conclusion. So if you look, for example, these curves, the black curves are Germany. The green curves, the gray curves are US. The triangles are the share of population unemployed. The circles are the share of population without health insurance. In the US, unemployment went up during COVID period. But when you lose your employment in the US, you have some probability to use also health coverage. And the circle gray shows the fraction of US individuals without health insurance. It went down with Obamacare here, but it went up again during COVID. Whereas in Germany, you have a system that provides health insurance for everybody, remains zero. Share of people without health insurance in Germany, zero throughout. And that's true if I put instead of Germany, France or the Scandinavian countries so the US or Germany was not good at health insurance during COVID. But instead of health insurance, I could look at poverty. When you go unemployed, you are more likely to go into poverty. The gray, the circle gray is the share of population on the verge of poverty. It went up during COVID, okay? Because when you lose employment in the US, you are likely to fall into poverty. No such thing in Germany, you see. So that's the thing. And so on social, the US is dominated by Europe, particularly Western Europe and Scandinavia, very much so. But now when it comes to innovation, it's the other way around. And we look at that in chapter 12 of the book. In fact, if you look at biotech, number of biotech patents per habitant, so that we mentioned that in the conclusion, much more in the US than elsewhere. They innovate much more. And if I was looking at the best patents, the triadic patents, for example, the gap or the highly cited patents, the gap is even bigger between US and the rest of the world. So they have a fantastic ecosystem of innovation in the US. And we explained that in chapter 12. First, they have very good basic research, very well-funded and organized universities. Also, they have these institutions like the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health for biotech. And they also have privately funded institutions like the Howard Hughes Medical Investigator and other foundations that finance long-term promising research for promising researchers. All that is only for basic research. But then when you want to turn the basic research into applied innovation, you create a startup. There you need venture capital, and they have much more developed venture capital in the US than elsewhere. When the firms become bigger, you need institutional investors, pension funds, mutual funds. They have much more of that in the US than in Europe. And they also have the BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority for vaccines. But that was done on the model of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. The Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, was created in the 1950s during the Cold War, but now we are back in the Cold War. So I cannot talk about the Cold War in the past now, since last week. It was the first Cold War, the one with the Soviet Union. Now we are in the second one with Russia. So the thing is that the US were racing on space and defense with the Soviet Union, and they needed, to go quickly to find new systems of defense and space very quickly. The basic research was done, but you needed to coordinate actors and resources to turn the basic research into operational technologies, and so they created the DARPA. The money comes from the ministry. They have team leaders. The team leaders elicit competing projects and to achieve a mission. Put a man in space within 2 years, or find this kind of weapons, make them operational. That's mission. The basic research is done, and you need to achieve the mission. And that's what they did with the DARPA. It's a mixture of top-down. The money comes from the ministry, but bottom-up is that the team leaders elicit many competing projects, private-public partnership, and all that. So it works really well. For example, the GPS, the laser, the autonomous navigation, internet are indirectly byproducts of DARPA. Then they created the ARPA Energy in the US, and then they created the BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Product and Development Authority. And that's why they did the vaccines based on the RNA messenger. You know, they had the technology for RNA messenger, and they turned that basic research into production of vaccines based on that within a year. So, and it was competing labs. You had Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson, and many other labs that you don't know about. And that's how they did. And the BARDA spent $12 billion last year, when Europe spent a total of $4 billion, and not on the equivalent of BARDA. We don't have the equivalent institutions to BARDA. So you see all the ecosystem of innovation that the US has. So you see socially, Europe dominates in terms of social model, the US, but in terms of innovation ecosystem, the US dominates the rest of the world. So of course, now what you would like is a capitalism that combines the good side of the American model, being innovative, with the good side of the European model, being more egalitarian, more inclusive and protective. Some people believe that if you want one, you can't have the other. That if you choose to be more innovating, you have to give up on being more protective and inclusive. If you choose to be more protective and inclusive, you have to give up on being more innovative. I don't believe so. I believe that there are policies that makes you both more innovative and more inclusive and protective. Let me talk about three of them. What I call flex security on the labor market, what I talk about education and competition. So let me talk about them in turn. So flex security. In chapter 11 of the book, we talk about labor market, creative destruction, labor market, health and happiness. Here you have, that's from Anne Case and Angus Deaton, and it shows the number of the fraction of population it shows the mortality rate of white non-Hispanics on skill between 50-54 age. And it increased a lot in the US since the 2000. Nothing equivalent in other countries. So that's interesting. It decreased a little bit in UK, but not much compared to US. Okay. So in fact, they explain that those die of despair. When you lose your employment in the US, I've already mentioned, you are more likely to fall into poverty and to lose health insurance. You lose status, your family, disintegrates. And so unemployment in the US and creative destruction is associated with lots of unhappiness and stress. So when people are stressed, they take opioids, they take antidepressants, sleeping pills and all that, and they start eating a lot and becoming obese, and that increases mortality. But Alexandra Roulet in Denmark shows that, it's not the same in Denmark. In Denmark, they have the flex security model. When you lose your employment in Denmark, for 3 years, you have 90% of your salary. And then the state helps you find a new job and retrains you. And if you refuse more than 2 jobs in your qualification, you lose the subsidy. But it's a system that really works well because it makes creative destruction very efficient because you retrain workers and firms have the ability to hire and lay off. That's no problem because they have a system that with a very good safety net. So the flex security system makes creative destruction work much better. But on the other hand, it protects people because you see here, we compare the health of a worker in a firm that closes down to an identical worker in terms of age, experience, education, and all that in a firm that does not close down. It's a diff and diff, if you want. And you see that there is no difference between the before and the after the firm closes down. The difference between the worker in the firm that closes down and the firm that does not close down, here we look in the difference in terms of purchase of antidepressants, anti-anxiety, or sleeping pills. No effect. That means that they were identical before, they are identical afterwards. Same thing for probability to visit hospital for circulatory problem. No difference before, no difference after between the worker that was working in a firm that does not close down and the one working in a firm that then closed down. Same on mortality, no effect. So you see, that's the first instance is that a very good flex security system like in Denmark made creative destruction work much better, but without reducing protection and inclusiveness. It helps people, integrate the labor market actually and protects people. Okay, now education is another one. And in chapter 10 of the book, we look at the link between the probability. We talk about the phenomenon of lost Einsteins. In fact, you see, the thing is that there are many smart children, but the problem is not all of them can become innovators, because when you have parents from poor families, you are much less likely to be innovator. And that's shown on this graph. This graph shows the relationship between parental income on the horizontal axis and the probability of inventing on the vertical axis. And you have this J curve. The left-hand side graph, the left-hand graph is US on recent data from Belchetti, Jaravel, Petkova, Van Rienan. The middle graph is the US historical data from Aksigit, Grisby, Nicholas. And the right-hand side is my own work now I'm doing on the Finnish data. And you see that everywhere you are much more likely to invent when you have parents that earn a lot. So that shows that you have a lot of lost Einsteins. And that if you were, now the problem is, why do you have that? And so we dig a bit deeper for the Finland. And in Finland, in fact, we realize that when you control for parental education, the curve goes down. It moves from being the blue curve into being the red curve. So it means that, in fact, because of course in Finland, you see what happens, that the school is free and high quality. So how come, it should be a problem, parental income, since you don't have anything to pay, there is no tuitions there. And the thing is that the problem is that the parents that earn more are also more educated parents, and they can transmit knowledge and aspirations to their children. That's why when you control for education of the parents, the curve moves down. Now it's very interesting, because in Finland, you could say, well, if the school is so good, why do you need parental education at all? But in fact, the school is very good in Finland since 1970. Before, it was not so good. It was not so inclusive. And if you restrict attention to researchers that went to school themselves after 1970, you find that, in fact, there is no J curve anymore. The J curve is really for those who went to school before the 1970s. There, the parental education matters and the parental income matters. Now, you see, if we were to maintain the current Finnish educational system for many generations in a row, the curve would become flat. So to go back to my lost Einsteins, in our economies, we suffer from the fact we have many smart children. They could become innovators, but because they were born to poor families with parents who are non-educated, they suffer and they don't become inventors. If we were to have now a more inclusive education system, like you have now in Finland for several generations in a row, then you will have much more people who can innovate. So that will boost innovation, but it will also make innovation more inclusive. So that's, again, education is a policy that makes you both more innovative and more inclusive. Now I talk about competition, but I already spoke about competition. I told you about the secular stagnation in the US, that it was due largely to the superstar firms and the fact that they inhibit entry by non-superstar firms. Entry goes down since 2000. So now if you were to put a more adapted to reform competition policy in the US, what will happen? There will be more new entry. So that will boost innovation, but it will also make the growth more inclusive, because we know that entrant innovation boosts social mobility. We saw that earlier. So by boosting competition policy, you will both increase competition, but also increase social mobility. You see, so that makes my point that there is not an either or. You can be both more innovative and more inclusive. So at the end of the day, let me go back. Remember, I told you about the pessimism of Schumpeter. He thought that early innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would prevent subsequent innovation. But now you could say that's the market firms, is the market. But now you would say, well, there can be the state there, because the state can monitor the firms. They can impose competition policy. But we saw when we talked about middle income trap, that when you have very powerful conglomerates, they can not only prevent new entry, but they can also put pressure on government not to implement more competitive policies. And so then you could say, well, but maybe when you have a judiciary to control the government, you can circumvent that party. It's true to some extent, but that's not enough, because the constitution, even if you have separation of power between executive and judiciary power, the constitution is an incomplete contract. And that we explained that in chapter 15 of the book. And but because constitution is an incomplete contract, civil society can play a crucial role as a means of ensuring the effective enforcement of the constitutional contract. That's where civil society is so important. So the response to Schumpeter is that you are right to be pessimistic, but you have the state who can do things. The state can regulate monopolies. Alors you could say, well, but the state can be captured by incumbent interests. You're right, but their civil society plays a big role. In the US, they voted Biden, and you have now new education competition reforms. And so the triangle between firms, markets, firms, state, and civil society, as stressed by Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin, is a very powerful tool to also make sure that you sustain creative destruction and you avert the pessimist prediction of Schumpeter. But we also saw the role of this triangle when we spoke about green innovation. Firms are those that innovate, green or not. The state can be there to redirect technical change using carbon tax or industrial policy or subsidy to green innovation. But we saw also the role that consumers can play in pushing firms to innovate greener. To just talk about the civil society, a good example is the civil rights movement in the US. You had the Civil War in the US in the 19th century that was won by the North. The result was that they abolished the slavery, and they introduced the 15th Amendment in the US Constitution that gave voting rights to the African Americans. The problem is that the southern states circumvented that by imposing literacy tests to the Black population, which they would never pass. So it took the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and 70s, but particularly in the 50s and 60s, until you had the voting right, the Voting Act of the Supreme Court in 1964. That means 1 century later than the Civil War, to outlaw the literacy tests and make sure that the African Americans could indeed vote. But you see again how the triangle works. If you didn't have the civil rights, the civil society, this 15th Amendment would have remained completely, useless. And that's the outline of the book. But maybe I stop there and I answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your intriguing session.
Yeah.
And that has actually portrayed the power of creative destruction to our audience. And the interest your session has actually peaked today in our audience can be justified by the number of questions we're having in the chat box. So let's get started with the Q&A session. So we'll allow the participants to unmute themselves and ask the question live so that the seminar becomes much more interactive. So Prabal, would you like to go ahead first?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you so much, Professor, for the session. I have one question. So what are the characteristics of the countries that are able to rapidly innovate? So for example, like there are some countries that perform better in a time of adversity, while others fail back to rely on other nations at the time of adversity. One, that there is difference between the size. Even small countries can develop, innovate rapidly at the time of adversity, and large nations which even have power and money and resources tend to fail out on innovation. And also, just one point. So you said that many times big companies collude with the government, and which ultimately sort of decreases the overall level of innovation that occurs into the economy. I also had one more point to make, is that if we see the current pattern, the number of patents held by large corporations are way more than the small companies. So do you have any comments on that? So those
well, there is a big lot. I will answer the last part. I mean, because there is a lot in what you said. The small firms tend to make bigger innovation than the large firms. I mean, it's true that the most radical innovation tend to be made by smaller firms. But on the other hand, you grow by innovating. So you see, there is a whole thing of firm dynamics. You see, you enter, you grow because you innovate successfully. But it's true that in your lifetime, you tend to make the bigger innovations when you're early, in general, I mean, on average. Then when you become big incumbent and big conglomerates, you tend to innovate less. So what you try to do then is to absorb new innovators by merger and acquisition. So usually that's how you grow later on. But I missed a bit the rest of your question. I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe Prakap, could you tell me what was meant? It would help me maybe Praka or someone else who is, I don't know who is chairing the session. Is it Praka? Yeah. Can you summarize the question in a nutshell? It might be helpful for me because otherwise I don't get the whole thing. I'm sorry.
Okay, Professor, maybe I can say this in simple words. Okay.
Yeah, because otherwise it's too much. I can't. Yeah.
Yes. So a simple question is, what are the characteristics of countries that are able to rapidly innovate at the time of adversaries? So like there are examples where small countries are able to innovate rapidly in the time of difficulties, while larger countries have
countries. Okay. So on that question, I don't know if it's related to small or large. I mean, look, I mean, the US, you had the COVID and they had the Barda. I'm not sure it's linked to the size of the country. You see what I mean? It depends on the policy you have, but individual European countries are much smaller than the US and they didn't do much. And the US did a lot. So on innovation, you see. So it's one thing is the size of the firm. Large firms tend to be more rigid, but the size of the country, I'm not sure there. You see what I mean? The big innovations, the biggest innovations are done by the US, and which is a big country. So I think size of firms, I understand. Size of countries, I'm not sure there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your insightful answer.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to next. Devansh, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I hope I'm audible. Prakhar, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, Professor, do you think the high innovation levels in US are somehow related to the private status of most of their Ivy League universities? I mean, do we see any evidence that private universities are more innovative and innovation friendly than public universities everywhere in the world?
Yeah, it's true that you're right. I mean, I looked at that with Caroline Hawksby. What matters is the autonomy of the university. In Switzerland, they are not really private, and they are very efficient, but they are more autonomous. What matters really is the autonomy of the university, and we discussed that in chapter 10 of the book. What's important is the autonomy. It's true when you are private, you are autonomous, but you can have also autonomy. For example, in Switzerland, they belong to the canton, you see, and so you still have a fair amount of autonomy, and they let. So it's very important, the autonomy, and the governance also. They need to be well governed. For example, to have a board of directors separate from the academic board, that's important. But you could have that also in public universities. So in Scandinavia, they have public universities. I think what matters is the governance of the university and the funds. Of course, it's true, you need to be well funded. But if you can be well funded and autonomous, that does it. It's true that private universities, it's easier for them to be both well funded and autonomous. But the true thing that's important are those two things.
And Professor, are the innovation levels in some way related to the fees of the university?
I don't know about that. Yeah, maybe the most renowned universities charge higher fees. Although it's not true in California, because in California, the state finances university. Berkeley is publicly financed, so I'm not sure. You see there, it's not necessarily the case. It's not a one-to-one.
Yeah. That was great, Professor. Thank you for your answer. And from next speaker, we'll limit the question only to one, so that everyone can ask their question. Sahil, would you like to go next?
Yes, good evening, Professor. Actually, my question is like, as you explained about that industrial outburst in Europe, especially in London in 19th century, Could you explain that what was the core factor of expansion of industry in China after 1950, despite of the communalism? The capitalism in the China rose at a high speed. Could you explain me what was the reason and what were the core factors?
Yeah. Alors China, the book is not on China, quoi. China, you had Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping introduced capitalism. I mean, they moved to a capitalist system, in fact, to a large extent. They had state-owned firms, but they unleashed market forces. Quoi. That was very important. It's true that in China, you have now firms, more or less like we have. You have the state, civil society. You don't have that much. Quoi. But you already have state but competition, you have international competition. So they play the international competition. And China, it's still a catching up growth in China to a large extent. They innovate more and more, but it's still a catching up growth to a large extent. They took advantage of the fact you have education in China. Everybody is educated, combined with openness, with entering the WTO. And they absorbed technologies from foreign direct investors. So that combination, spurred growth a lot in China. Now their fear is to fall into the middle income trap. That's the concern they have. So will they be able to become fully innovative without the freedom and without a civil society like we do have? That's a big question. But they managed to do well to a large extent so far because you have state-owned, you have a lot of DARPA, BARDA, Chinese version of BARDA and DARPA. You have a lot of that there. And on the research, they send lots of people to the US to work in the US. So with the DARPA, with their own DARPAs and collaboration with US, they managed to do pretty okay so far. But they don't have the freedom. So it's interesting how they try to circumvent. They free ride on the freedom in the US. It's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. That was indeed a detailed answer. Since we are running late, would you like to take some questions, if that's fine with you?
Yeah.
Sure. So I'll just read out the questions of people who have preferred to remain anonymous. The question is, creative destruction creates the possibility of structural unemployment. There is a regional shift in the employment hub. How it is ensured that regions with high unemployment rate have the infrastructure and opportunities to prevent prolonged unemployment post-creative destruction?
No, you have no guarantee. You need a system that will create mobility, that will make sure that the unemployed are retrained and can move into new sectors. So there is no guarantee at all. You could have long-term unemployed. So it's important to retrain the workers that become, to both give them insurance and retrain them so that they take risk, you see, with the insurance, but also you force them to retrain. That's why the Danish system is very good, because you can't just stay there and do nothing. You have to retrain and look for new jobs, and they help you look for new jobs. But if you do that, you are okay. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. That will actually clarify the answer.
Yeah.
One last question in the paucity of time. In a post-COVID economy, where there is high recovery, how important is it that governments in the developing world implement policies that protect startups and entrepreneurs from big conglomerates?
No, so it's important. You're right, because COVID somehow shielded firms and created zombie firms. You're right. The one problem with COVID, we had to do that to guarantee that the economy would jumpstart again. But it's true that it somehow exacerbated the phenomenon of zombie firms. So that's always the problem. The state has to be there to help people relocate, but they should not maintain firms that are non-viable indefinitely, because otherwise you prevent the creative destruction. And if you prevent exit, you slow down entry of new firms. And that's the difficult balance for the government to manage creative destruction. You have to make sure that you help people and firms as well, but you have to make sure also that you don't do that at the expense of new entrants. And that's always a difficulty. If you help incumbents too much, it ends up being at the expense of entry. And you need to keep the balance between the two.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your enlightening answers to satisfy the curiosity of our attendees. That was a really great session.
Thank you.
With time, we'll not take further more questions. I request Manya for a vote of thanks.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Manya.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for this incredibly enlightening talk, Professor. I'm sure all of us learned something new today. I would like to thank everyone in the audience for joining and asking such thought-provoking questions. Lastly, I would like to thank all the members of Ashoka Economic Society who helped in making this happen. Professor, on behalf of the entire team, I would like to thank you again for taking out time from your busy schedule. We would love to have you again for such brilliant lectures. Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
So much. All the best. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.